Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. You are listening to a podcast by Pastor Eric Deepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. If you enjoy Faith Over Breakfast, we encourage you to rate it on the Apple Podcast app, on Spotify, or Google Play. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. My name is Eric Deepen, and I'm a pastor at the Village Church in Tucson, Arizona. Andy Littleton is, I don't know where he's at, but he's not here.
Somewhere.
So I've got Mark Crawford, who's also a pastor at the Village Church, and we just start talking and hanging out. And I thought, hey, let's do a Faith Over Breakfast podcast because I wanted to keep content coming. I don't want to be off for 2 weeks. So
we had a grand old time.
We had a really good time. We talked about intellectual property. We talked about the Battle Ready podcast from Aaron McManus and Erwin McManus, and one of their podcasts called Steal an Idea, which is really interesting conversation. And I would suggest I'll put a link to their podcast too, so you can kind of listen to the two together, and sort of just think things through. And you're like, oh, wow, Eric and Mark, they steal a lot of stuff. That's what you'll learn in this podcast.
It's going to be great.
But a couple of quick things that we've got that you need. If you got a question, and I know a couple of you already sent us some questions that we'll deal with when Andy gets back. But if you got a question, we will answer it on air and send you a book from our bookshelf. We've sent a number of books out, so we're getting questions from you. Bookshelf's getting smaller. But also, if you support the Faith Over Breakfast podcast by clicking the donate tab next to the podcast, you can send us money and say, hey, this is for Faith Over Breakfast. And if you're in the city, we'll let you be a guest host. Otherwise, we'll just send you a book. But
do I get a book?
No.
Oh, man.
Because you can pull any book off the bookshelf when you want to read it. So
do the podcast.
Yes. All right. So anyway, do the podcast. It's faithoverbreakfast@gmail.com. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Eric.
Hey, Mark.
Hello.
How you doing? So
good.
Welcome to Faith Over Breakfast. Andy's gone, and I didn't even say, hey, Andy, I'm going to just use Mark. But Mark's around, and I like to do Faith Over Breakfast podcast, and you're a pastor.
I am a pastor. And I have coffee.
And you have coffee, and I have a drink, and we're...
Can I tell you something? It's been a while since I've been on Faith Over Breakfast.
It's been a long time.
I really miss, and this goes back several years, but I really miss the sound of... You guys eating
many
like
listeners
your
do
sandwiches.
Not miss that. They do not miss.
It just helped me know that I was in the experience of Faith Over Breakfast.
Yes, this is true. All right, so we don't know how long this podcast is going to go. It may just go for a few minutes, but I want to talk about intellectual property.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to...
Great.
So recently I was listening to a podcast called Battle Ready. Okay,
Battle Ready?
This is a...
oh, boy.
Podcast by Aaron McManus and Erwin McManus.
Erwin
McManus.
A writer you like.
He's more known for being a speaker and a author and a pastor of the church Mosaic.
Right.
And Aaron is his son, and I think his son does a lot of the social media. And
sure.
They have a design company. And I mean, these are creative people.
Sure.
So they have a podcast that they just did, and I want to make sure I get the title of this podcast. Well, they didn't.
The specific episode
this
title
episode
is what you,
yeah.
The podcast is called Battle Ready.
Battle Ready.
And you want to know what the specific
let me
podcast
give you
title
the
was.
title of the podcast. Steal This Idea.
Steal This Idea.
Okay, so here's the thing. They're talking about how pastors steal intellectual property a lot and own it for themselves. So first, let me just tell you kind of their story, and then I think the Village has a little bit of a different take and process stuff. I want to process like how we deal with the things that God has given us.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I think it's important.
Yeah.
So when you become an international speaker, apparently what you run into is that people have stolen your ideas.
A problem both of us know a ton about.
Yes. And so they preach your sermons at a conference of which you then are going to preach the same sermon.
Oh.
Right. Okay.
Intrigue.
Or you have a pastor of a church that's even larger than yours preach your sermon and then be accused by one of their congregants of stealing it from them.
I assume these are things that have actually happened.
These are things that Erwin has experienced.
Okay.
So they've got some things going on here.
All right.
Now, he even had somebody, he talks on the podcast, who is a South American pastor who copied his whole sermon series on the book we read of his, The Arrow or something like that, on creativity.
Right.
And used his stories as if they were this pastor's stories about getting cancer and everything.
These are my stories. I'm telling them as my stories.
Right.
Oh, boy. Ooh.
Okay, so this is a stealing that neither of us would say is right or good.
Yeah, not great.
Right, not great. And probably you don't, if I preached a sermon and some guy picked it up on the internet and stole it, I would never know. Right?
Sure.
Because I'm not going to his church. Sure. I'm not going to conferences.
Unless it was Erwin McManus.
Unless it was Erwin McManus who stole my sermon. I'd be like, wait a minute.
Hey, hold on.
Hey, that's Erwin's. But in particular, well, I would argue when it comes to material and also when it comes to music, the Village kind of looks at these things differently, right? Mm-hmm. So we started out with a really promoting this idea at the very beginning of this new way of copywriting your stuff, and it was called open source. And
sure.
People probably remember the old day of open source programming. That's where you get what's the name of that computer?
Man, program. I don't know anything about computers.
Okay, well, it doesn't matter. It'll come to me, and then I will say it.
Python?
No, not Python.
I don't know.
It's a yeah. I'll remember it in a minute. Anyway, I feel stupid.
Linux.
There you go.
Oh yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. So, but
apparently I know
it went to books and music. You could open source this, and open sourcing had only one requirement: that you acknowledge the original person.
Right.
But you could sell it, you could change it, you could do whatever you wanted to it. Right.
As long as you acknowledge the original author.
Right. So that's key.
Sure.
In that particular thing. So we started doing that with our music, and so I just want you to talk a little bit about what you think as a musician who's written tons of music, as a pastor who's now put out a number of sermons. Out of a community that has unique things that you've contributed to. Like, what do you feel? Well, let me make one more argument, because this is Erwin's argument for really guarding your content. And that is that he doesn't build houses. He doesn't, pave roads. What he does is creates ideas,
right,
and thoughts, and so that's his thing. And so unless he's selling it to you for you to use, it's his, not yours. Right. I agree with him to some extent, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that when it comes to intellectual property in the context of the church, right, and the community.
So this is like a really big problem worldwide.
Yes.
Something that people are thinking through a ton.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it everywhere, from music to like movies that come out in the same year that are basically the same idea. You see that happen a lot, where you get these people going between companies and grabbing the same ideas. You get it in, one place where I've seen this a lot is in like YouTube, TikTok,
right, videos
where like someone will do something and then you see someone else do the same thing and it becomes way more popular.
Right.
And they're making the exact same joke.
Right.
They just are more popular, or they did it a little bit better or whatever. It just grabbed the right eyes.
The idea, right.
Right. Or it just like happened at the right moment and the right person saw the second video and it blew up.
Right.
So you see this a lot. And so when I first started writing music, I wrote a song, and I don't even remember how it goes now. I think it's on my SoundCloud. But I wrote this song, and my sister's friend, who was in mariachi with her, invited us to go help lead worship at their church for something.
Okay.
One Sunday, and they had come over to my house. It was her and her dad had come over to our house for a party, and we had played music together. And he said, "Oh, I really like that song that you played.
Right.
Can we play it when you guys come to lead worship at our church?"
Yeah.
And I said, "Okay, sure, yeah." And so we played it, and I taught it to him. And I found out about 2 years later that he just kept playing it.
Right.
Like he kept that was like my first experience of someone playing something I had written.
Yeah.
Just like off doing that. And I actually have no idea if that's happening right now. I mean, I know your parents really like Liberation Hymn.
Yeah, so that
which is
gets
a song that
sung
it gets sung
yeah.
when I'm not there.
Yeah.
Which is just a really kind of a weird experience for me.
We gave Zephaniah 3:13 to the one church in Minnesota, we gave them
Zephaniah 3:17.
17, yeah. So we gave that to them.
Yes.
I don't know if they're singing it, but the pastor wanted it, so.
Yeah. So my music, it's always it's a battle for me.
Right. Okay.
Cuz I really like it.
Yeah.
And I think what I made was really good.
Sure.
But I also, the reason I write now is for my community.
Right.
So when I write music, it comes out of my experience with God, my relationship with God, my relationship in community, and it goes out and I give it to my community. I say, here you go. This is something I wrote. That often, most often. Occasionally I write things and it doesn't really fit in that context, but I'm constantly trying to give up my music and say, this is something that came out of my relationship with God, not something that I'm just kind of writing on my own.
Right.
And everything I write is church music.
Right.
So someone playing it at a different church, it'd be nice if they told me.
Sure.
But I don't really, I mean, I care in the sense of like, wow, that's cool. They're playing this song that came out of my relationship with God.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where I've settled. Coming from a place where it was really weird, and I kind of felt like, wait, should I have like copyrighted that or whatever?
Right.
Especially at a point where I actually had someone who was mildly famous in a country music band in the 80s.
Right.
Like regionally famous, who was telling me at the time, you need to copyright everything you make, and I'm going to tell you how to do it.
Right.
And that was all. It was like the year, 2 years before I started coming to the village. Yeah.
All right. So let me ask you a couple questions about this and give you some examples. So, for one, people can go back on the village website and go way back to the original sermon section, and you can listen to a sermon on John chapter 2, I believe, the part where Jesus kicks the money changers out, right? Mm-hmm. And I verbatim, if you go listen to this, like I memorized a sermon, Mark Driscoll's sermon, and I did it on purpose because I wanted to practice his particular delivery. We were preaching on that section. Yeah. I didn't steal his stories.
Yeah.
Right? I told my own stories, but I wanted to learn the structure. Now, I didn't tell anybody that I had done that. This was early on before the internet, right? So there's not a lot of people.
Sure.
No one's listening.
No one's going and listening to the old feed.
Now, somebody needs to understand something. There's a book that Sue has. It's called Steal Like an Artist. And you also have to understand there's a tradition within the church where you would take other people's sermons and read them, right? That's what you would do. You just take this sermon and then you would read it at your country church.
Yeah.
None of the elders would. So that's part of it. For me, I didn't think, I need to say this is from Mark Driscoll. It was just like, I'm going to preach this sermon. I'm going to practice. I'm going to learn.
Sure.
That's how I'm going to learn to do this a little bit better. I was trying to prove. So there's an example there. But like when people come to the village and they're asking, like, hey, what's it about? Why do you do all this stuff? I said, well, do you know about Mars Hill? And they say, oh yeah, I've heard of that church. Well, the village looks like and is modeled after the early days of Mars Hill. So I give credit to that influence in our community and what it looks like.
Yeah.
But a lot of that was just how you do things, and what things might look like when it comes to community. But when it comes to, just all that to say, some of my dreams when it comes to intellectual property is, it would be really sad to me if like one of my songs got picked up, like say by Hillsong, and they made millions and millions of dollars on it and said, hey, this is our song. And I would probably call them and say, hey, that's not your song.
That's not your song.
But can we work out some deal? And if they said no, and I'd be like, okay. Because it's not my song either, actually. It's God's song.
Yeah.
And so if they want to use God's song in a way that's probably not completely honest, that's fine. To make money off of it, yeah. But if somebody preached one of your sermons and you found out about that, and they didn't use your stories, because I think when you
stealing the stories is pretty weird.
Like, did they just use your outline? They told
your outline,
and then used your stories and preached it. And they didn't say, I found this sermon by Mark, Crawford, and they just gave it.
They just did it. Yeah.
And then you found out about it. How would you feel about that?
I think it'd be weird.
Okay.
I'd feel weird about it, but I actually think we do this all the time.
Yeah.
Just because as pastors, we listen to a lot of stuff.
And read a lot of stuff. And like, we're constantly taking in kind of, that's interesting. Like, at least us as pastors. Yes.
I mean, I don't know about other pastors necessarily, but
they read commentaries all the time.
Well, so I gave a sermon on joy, and I went back and took a definition of joy that Rod gave like 15 years ago.
Right.
And then when I was going to preach on joy again, I forgot that I had pulled that quote from a sermon by Rod.
Yeah.
And the next time I was going to preach, I was going to say like, oh yeah, I remember like I was preaching and I came up with this great definition of joy. And then I was like, well, I should go back and listen to that sermon again because I don't remember the context a lot. And so I went back and listened, and then in that sermon, I was like, I listened to this sermon by Rod 15 years ago. Right. And I was like, oh, it's not my idea. Right? Because it's so easy to forget when you take in a lot. And it's hard to remember sometimes where stuff comes from.
Right. Well, here's like...
But taking like an entire sermon, like that takes some intention, right?
That does take some.
That takes intention to go and to listen to the sermon and get the entire outline, and then even changing the stories. But like,
it takes some time.
More so than like, oh, I really like that sermon topic. I'm gonna preach on that. Right. And oh yeah, I liked a couple of these ideas. So I'm gonna take some of these ideas and build it out myself. Feels different from like the intention of I'm going to take the entire outline and rework it. Yeah.
Well, here's a funny story about how all this works. So, a lot of people know my Holy Spirit hug, right? And people who hear the Holy Spirit hug would think, oh, that's Eric's. But if you go back and listen to me, I talk about how Frank Lloyd Jones, the pastor, invented this idea, and then Matt Chandler took it and he told it, and then I'm taking what Matt and Lloyd Jones did, and I'm doing my thing with it. And then I took another pastor's joke about how pastors steal things and I told his joke because it's essential to understanding how we do this, right? But I didn't say, oh, and I'm also taking this guy's joke to help you understand, because honestly, if I did that, we'd sit here and I'd say, okay, so we're looking at this Greek word. Now I just need to stop here. And I got this idea from N.T. Wright. I got this idea from this guy. I got this from this commentary and this, and they're all their ideas. None of them are mine. And I've just coalesced them because I have 25 minutes to get an idea across 30 minutes. I'm not going to do that.
But if I sit down with you after your sermon and say, hey, I really like this piece. Part of the conversation is, oh yeah, I was reading N.T. Wright.
Yeah, and N.T. Wright
he was talking about this and this and this.
Yeah. Or I was looking at Barclay's commentary and he breaks it down here. Or I was, that's.
So the thing that comes to mind, let me tell you, this is what comes to mind, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because this is my understanding, but I don't remember where I got this.
Right.
My understanding of they were surprised at Jesus because he spoke with authority.
Yeah.
Is that he didn't quote all the rabbinical texts.
Yes.
He just went straight to the prophets and said, this is what the prophets meant.
Yes.
I mean,
and of course we need to pause there and say that we didn't figure that out. We
right.
were told that by commentaries and other teachings and stuff.
So I think it's we're all going to do this.
Yes. Right.
And I think some of it is what's the like level as a preacher, at what point do I say, hey, I took this sermon from someone else?
Yeah.
Because I can take ideas from particular sermons,
right,
and craft my own sermon and say this is what's good for my community today.
Sure.
But if I'm going to take, at what level, how much of an outline needs to come directly from someone else's sermon before I say, hey, a lot of this I got from this one sermon, and you should go listen to that sermon too. Which is different with music.
Yeah.
That we create as churches.
Oh, and I also think. Certainly the sermon is a creative endeavor and you do need to bring your own creativity to it. But, a lot of times if I'm really relying heavily, maybe say just on a single author to bring forward what I'm talking about, or if there's a series of sermons that are going to influence me, then have influence, I'll say I'm leaning heavily on. So people, can know, we can ask him and he can kind of point us in the direction. Now, I think here's an intellectual property ripoff that we did recently that we didn't give credit to, but I kept meaning to do, and I fixed recently. Oh. But it's our recent series on grief and gratitude.
Oh, yes.
As a church that comes from a series of podcasts by Dan Allender. Loosely. But if you go and listen to each sermon, you realize that we're not resting too heavily on what's actually said in the. We used them as a little bit of a guide. We loved their titles.
And we listened to them.
Yeah, and it was helpful.
And a lot of what they talked about informed some of what we were saying. What we were saying.
And if you listen to the podcast and then you listen to our sermon series, you can hear the influence and you can hear it weaved in and out, but it's not the content.
It's not the same.
So, but we didn't say at the beginning, hey, like, we're resting heavily on this.
Yeah.
And I don't think we needed to. I did put into our sermon notes a link to the podcast and say, hey, this is based on the series.
Right.
Which I just kept meaning to do and forgot. But some of it is, this is the other thing. The idea that I've been wrestling with, because honestly, if someone came and they looked at the Village and they said, oh, this is great, I love this, and they picked our brains, but then we never heard from them again, and 5 years later, I go, somewhere in Oklahoma, and I say, oh, this church called the Village, we should go to it. And we go to Oklahoma, and we go to this church's Village, and we walk in, and it's got couches, and they're singing Trinity, and they're singing,
our music,
and they're talking about pilgrim groups, and they're like so excited, and it looks like it's growing and vibrant. And they never say, hey, like there's a church named the Village, and we just have pretty much. I would be excited. I wouldn't be like, hey, like, you guys, shame on you.
Oh, this is so cool.
This is the greatest thing. Why did you tell us so we could actually work together? This is really fun. Yeah. Or if I went to a church and I heard one of the, songs that I've written and I didn't know, and I heard this other band playing it, I would be honored, because I don't really want to make money off my music.
Oh, man, I would be so excited if I walked into a church and they were playing one of my songs.
Right.
It would kind of blow my mind. I'd be like, God, this is great. This is so much fun. I get to sing my song with all of these people and listen to someone else. I think that's actually part of what's really helped me with all this, is actually having your wife sing my songs.
Yeah.
Especially songs, and there's one in particular, but there's songs that Sue sings, the songs that I wrote, that Sue sings like far and away better than me.
Right.
And that has really helped me to go, oh, right, like, this is better in your hands.
Right.
And this is good.
So, two things then I think about this whole intellectual property. Number one, your story is your story.
Yep.
And no one should steal that.
Yeah, don't steal someone else's story.
Number two, there is a different, like, as pastors, let's just say there are different versions of pastors. Some of us are conference speakers who are really developing ideas and are visionaries.
Sure.
And are trying to help the world see things differently.
Sure.
If you're at that level, I think you should be able to have your ideas and other people shouldn't be stealing them, right? They shouldn't be taking your ideas in books and rewriting them into other books and they need to honor you.
Yeah.
But at our level, in what I would call the folk pastors.
Folk pastors. That's good.
Right?
I'll be a folk pastor.
We're folk pastors.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is, if you look at as classical and Baroque music developed, you also see that there is a stream of folk music, and folk music influenced the Baroque and then the classical movement, but it was its own thing, and it was much more flattened out, and it was much more narrative telling and had singing built into it. And it was low art. And I think there's a bunch of us low art pastors who really, and artists and community members, that we want our stuff. We take it all. Love on it, own it. We'd love you to acknowledge that we're here, but we're part of the folk story of Christianity. There are some people who aren't the folk story, and us down here should not grab Erwin's stuff or any other guy and bring it all down and say, oh, this is ours.
Yeah.
But we should be able to be influenced and honor those things. But we do live in a plagiarism society.
Yes.
And a laziness.
Yeah.
And so I think there's this tension.
Yeah.
Where we're like, oh, like, I don't steal from other people. I mean, artists steal from each other all the time. Yeah. I don't steal other people's stuff in order to not be creative. I steal it in order to build my own creative thing.
Yeah. And
out of it. And at times I need to acknowledge it, and at other times it's just part of the flow. And
yeah.
But
and some of with preaching, I feel like it's one thing. I think musicians have a harder time with this.
Sure.
Because there is some sense in which theoretically I could write a few songs separate from the village.
Yeah.
Record an album, and somehow, it catches on somewhere, and I could make some money off of it.
Right. And if you copyright it, then it's yours.
And it's mine.
And if someone steals it, then there are legal ramifications for it.
Right. And I think that's good. Like, I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Even for Christian artists. But I think our churches, especially in its like songwriting,
sure,
need to be creating a space where that's not the focus.
Yeah, no,
the focus is not like, oh, me as a songwriter, I'm going to write music and make money off of this, but rather, I think we need a lot more of like the bards, the people telling the story of the community, and allowing that to be just, here you go. Yeah. I wrote this song, take it.
Yeah,
and have that be okay, because we've built up this culture of like Hillsong,
right?
And Hillsong's just kind of the umbrella
for
picture
all, right.
for all. I'm not saying it's just Hillsong, but there's Hillsong and others where there's this idea of like, here's the professional songwriters.
Right.
Here are the people we should be singing. Like, they wrote the good songs and we should sing those songs.
Right.
And I don't think that's true.
Right.
And I think our churches need to hold the music that they're writing kind of with open hands.
Yeah.
And they should be writing music.
So, and I think creativity is a big deal at the Village. And I was listening again. I just kind of jumped back onto the Battle Ready podcast, and there's a reason for it. It's some things that God told me that I needed to kind of process through. If you want to know about that, you can talk to me afterwards. But they do an interview of the Mosaic worship team. They put out their second album or whatever. Cool. So they're talking about the process. And what I realized is I listened to them talk through the process of like a lot of creative people who may not be superb musicians or superb artists or who could do some collaborative things don't get this experience, don't get to offer the beautiful gifts that God's given them because they're not maybe at the master level, right?
Sure.
But when you hear them talk about their creative process, it grew them. Like, it created relationships. They talk about the tension it created, all that kind of stuff. If you're not, the beauty of creativity, especially collaborative creativity, is it forces you into interpersonal conflict and resolution. And that's what makes art beautiful. Yeah. And especially like music and even like Sue and I, who, when we preach, we get a different kind of sermon together because it's a creative process that builds tension and angst and then brings something beautiful out of it. Yeah. So I think the church should be fostering this in a broader sense. This is why I'm pro small church, not because I think big churches are bad. I just think one of the good things about a small church that's healthy is it activates creative people who wouldn't necessarily have an opportunity to be activated.
Well, and the hope in a small church is you're creating more community.
Yeah.
And creating space for more people to be directly involved. Sometimes when you get into the big church, even if you're creating the programs, it's hard to have access to sort of the front almost. Or like, it's hard to have that same kind of like, I feel like more people in a small church can have access.
We're a church of, we're a church of about 130 soaking wet, I like to say. Sometimes maybe more than that, but children and everything, that's who we are. There are members, in particular, a couple members in our church who could be or are paid to play certain instruments in larger churches.
Yes.
And my thought is, okay, here's this little church that you're recruiting people from, which is fine. But I'm like, you have a church of 2,000 people. There's not people who can do that in your community? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
I know in talking to people that there are a lot of people who play instruments.
Yeah.
And just need an opportunity and a reason to get better.
Even at the Village, we have a lot of people who play instruments who are very reticent to playing them on Sunday or whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a part of the discipleship process. Anyway, the intellectual property thing is interesting to me because I don't think Peter was going, yeah, man, I'm really upset that Paul like took a chunk of my letter and he just wrote it into his letter. And then, like their priority is the gospel.
Yeah.
And it's hard to be in a capitalist culture because people have to make livings.
Yeah.
But when it infiltrates the church, it's very dangerous, I think, capitalism.
Yes.
And ownership. So here's an interesting thing. Unless you put it in your contract, and since you don't have a contract at the Village.
I don't?
No. I mean, neither of us have a written contract.
Yeah.
But we should. But that means that every sermon you preach, because you're paid to preach a sermon, is not yours.
Yep.
Is owned by the church. And in fact, because you're paid to write music, the music is that you write here, the music I write, the music Susan writes, any one of the volunteers who volunteer and then write, they don't own the music, even if their name is on it. The people who it is Creative Commons is is what we use to copyright things. Yeah. But it's copyrighted by the Village as a creative, and so you are collaborating with the Village to do these things, and so they own these things.
Which is not to say that the Village is then going to turn around and like hold on to it and say, no.
We'd release it to whoever wants it, and to you.
If I wanted to go take some of my songs away somewhere else and record them
and make money off of them,
the Village would release them. Now that would create a lot of relational problems and tension. As long as you
let us play them, then we wouldn't care.
Well, there'd be we'd probably have some longer conversations about why I want to do that, because it kind of goes against what we're doing. But we're happy to let go of those, and that's largely because we're happy to let go of them now to anyone.
Yeah. So I was thinking, though, and this is where I kind of there were little moments during this podcast where I kind of got uncomfortable, because I'm like, okay, so right now the Village is 100, whatever we said it was, but what if it just, what if it turns into 1,000, 2,000 people? Mm-hmm. And so then people are taking, what the Village does, and they're using it and they're owning it, and because we haven't really loosey-goosey copyright things, they're not really even giving us credit for it, and maybe they're even doing a better job than we do and making lots of money out of it. Like, how would I feel? Could I honestly say I wouldn't care?
No.
Maybe.
I don't
would not
think
like
so.
to have prepared a sermon.
I think if Hillsong picked up one of your songs and gave you no credit and recorded it,
I'd be sad.
And recorded it better, you'd be sad.
Yes.
And you'd have a hard time with that. But that would be within the context of community. It'd be within the context of relationship with God and with your church.
Right. Now,
and we might send them a strongly worded letter. We might say, hey, so we'd like.
Well, and because now we're on Spotify,
Well, yeah.
All the songs that we've placed on Spotify, because Spotify automatically copyrights them all for us, those are all copyrighted. And so they would get a cease and desist from Spotify.
Yes.
If they put it up. But that's a whole different story. But we would.
And that's not all of our music.
No. We have. That's just a small selection of our music. But yeah, that's how that would work. Interesting.
But you would be sad.
Yeah.
Especially if they didn't say anything, if they just recorded it and took it as their own.
Yeah. No. So, and that's the thing. Like, we've actually got a couple Marcel songs on our Spotify, but we've given all the authors credit, and they're live productions of the songs for the most part. So we're not recording them to make money off them.
Right.
And here's a weird thing. None of theirs is copyrighted.
So technically, we own the copyright.
Yeah, isn't that weird? It's a really complicated.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. Anyway,
we would not hold to that.
Oh no, we wouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, we just give them. We don't make any money. So
we don't make any money out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. I do think it is. We take ideas all the time.
Yeah. And so how does that work as Christians? I think
how does that work? And, I mean, one thing we do often when we're trying to plan out our sermons is we'll often kind of look like, so we want to go through this book. Let's kind of look at what other people have done to like break it down. We'll do stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of taking ideas and kind of breaking them down. And we often shift those around anyway.
Right.
I do think there becomes a problem when you take the structure of a sermon and you don't say, I got it from this place.
Right. Sue and I were talking about this because she just preached a sermon.
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, well, it was all my own ideas, but it's probably 3 or 4 different sermons and books that are put together into one.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she's like, but I went back and I researched everything and made sure, So it's like if you hear a pastor say, yeah, so the Greek meaning of X word, and you think, I didn't know that word really meant that. I'll go back and look at it before I'm ever going to say that up front and do my own research. But what started me thinking about the meaning of this word was this guy's sermon and him telling us what that meant. And so is that his? I don't know. Especially if it's a new way of thinking about an idea, then you got to kind of backtrack. I think that's a good, beautiful thing. Yeah. But I think so we were talking, I said, your sermon was really good, and I could easily go preach that anywhere and just tell my own stories.
Yeah.
And I'd probably say, hey, like, this is a talk my wife gave, and I modified some of it, but I'm just going to tell you what she said because I think it's really good.
The key there, though, is telling your own stories.
Yeah.
Which I think is important anyway.
Yeah.
Because as a pastor, because if you're telling someone else's story, it's not authentic.
Right.
It's not genuine. You're not actually telling the story of the gospel. It's not your story to tell.
Yeah.
Which, if you go to C.S. Lewis, Aslan all the time in the Chronicles of Narnia tells people, I'm not telling you their story. I'm telling you your story.
Well,
and it's
that's
like
a Jesus thing
that's
from
a
the end
Jesus
of John.
thing.
Yeah, basically.
But like that's like we're telling your own story in preaching is important, even if you're taking the structure of someone else.
Right. Yeah. I just don't know how I could tell someone else. I mean, if I tell, and I have told a few of Rod's stories, but if I do that, I'm telling him about Rod.
Yes.
For an important point within the scripture. And I'm like, okay, so Rod has told us this, and I'll paraphrase the story and then go through the thing.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know. I just think this is it's a weird space because people are influenced. It's just, how do you work with all ideas or God's ideas, and then bring your own creative force to those things?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's a fun conversation. It's an interesting thing. And I do always have this, like, one of my dreams is to, like, go on vacation and walk into a church, and there they are singing one of my songs, and they don't know I'm there.
Yeah.
And no one but the musicians know how they got that song. And I'm like, that's cool.
This is cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Because the kingdom of God is, you're taking something that I did and to worship Jesus, and you're using it as an aid.
This came out of my relationship with God. It went out into the world, and God used it.
Right.
And he's still using it. even though I'm not involved.
Right.
And that's great. That's really cool.
And I think people operate with that idea. Like they think that's how worship music works. They think that, but they don't realize that there are laws, and that I get mail regularly from the CCLI.
Yeah.
Both for licensing movies and licensing music, and you have to pay based on the number of people you have in your congregation.
Yeah. Well, and this is an entirely different conversation.
Yes.
But I don't remember when you guys talk about Hillsong. I don't know. I don't know where this is coming from again, but there's like an entire conversation that's happening right now,
Right.
in the American church in particular, about should we sing
Hillsong
songs,
right,
or Bethel songs if there's like a poor theology, or if they have
yes,
obvious public sin that's unrepentant.
Yeah.
Or there's that whole conversation, which then becomes a whole
different thing,
different mess of stuff.
All right.
Which, anyway, that conversation is happening right now, and that's really interesting.
That is a very interesting one.
Yeah.
And so what Andy is going to say to me the next time he's on, when he's back to host, is, "Oh, I'm gone. So you talked about worship music because that's what you like to talk about."
Let's talk about worship music.
Yeah. So I always bring Mark on to talk about that kind of stuff.
All right,
so,
Andy. Let's see if you actually listen to this
all the way through.
You can say hi to me.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
Thanks, Eric.
You're welcome.
This is fun.
You've been listening to Faith Over Breakfast with Pastor Eric Siepen and Pastor Andy Littleton. Please share us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thank you.